Hey fellow photographer, so in this video I am doing a complete walkthrough of what it looks like for me to edit a session in Lightroom. I'm going to walk you through my process, talk through my settings, what I'm doing, how I'm changing things, so you can get an over-the-shoulder peek into how I edit in Lightroom for a brand photo session. I've already culled through and chosen the images for the gallery. So we've got 35 images that I have just imported, and they're right here. They are unedited. And I'm just going to show you my process for what I do once I put them into Lightroom. I'm just going to start with the first image here, and then I'm going to press D to go to the develop panel within Lightroom. And so for this, I'm just going to start with brightening up the exposure. I'm going to take down the highlights because the highlights are blown out on her dress and her face. I'm going to raise the shadows a little bit. This photo is meant to be a little bit more dark and moody. We're using a little more emphasis on the shadows. So I'm going to increase the white balance temperature a little bit more, the saturation, raise the blacks a little bit, raise the shadows a little bit more, and then just the tone curve just a little bit there, emphasizes the shadow. And as far as the color and whatnot, I'm okay with everything. And then I'll hit R to do a little crop. This is just an artistic preference type crop. And there we go. So then we go to this one, which is a little bit blown out in the background, and her face is in a major shadow. So I'm going to see what my preset does, and it just gives it kind of a base setting of a little bit of an exposure bump. I'm going to increase the white balance a little bit. I'm going to lift the shadows, her face, bring back the exposure down, bring the highlights down. And I'm not really trying to save the fact that her face is in shadow. That's actually what I was going for. But we're just going to brighten it up a little bit to go fit my style a bit better. Haze. And then bump the saturation just a little bit. Other than that, I think that looks pretty good. Next one. I'm going to start by cropping it. There's a lot of lines going on, and my recommendation is to line it up with the most dominant line in the photo. And as you can see, there's a lot going on. So I'm going to actually crop in a little bit more lines behind her back there, but also make sure that it looks mostly straight. That's a personal preference. I'm going to increase the exposure and contrast, bring the highlights down, shadows up, not too much, blacks up, bring that exposure up a little bit more. And so this, honestly, I think I might keep it in line more with the ceiling than the back because the wall wasn't so straight. And lower the white balance just a little bit. And so because this photo is so similar to the one before it, what I'm going to start with is just pressing previous, which is going to paste the settings of the previous photo onto this one. And then we're going to straighten it out, try to anyway. Sometimes you just gotta crop in so that the distracting uneven horizon line isn't in there. I'm gonna bump the contrast a little bit, bump the exposure a little bit more. And so I think that looks pretty good. So this one, it was a weird kind of day. It was pretty overcast and actually raining the day of this photo shoot, but we're gonna brighten this up a lot. Take her face out of shadow because her face was not meant to be in the darkness there. I'm gonna lower the highlights, gonna raise the shadows, raise the blacks a little bit more, gonna dehaze this just a little bit, I'm gonna lower the tint just a little bit too. And I'm just gonna straighten this out because crooked lines in photos are one of my personal pet peeves. And bump the saturation just a little bit. So as you can see, that's actually a really good improvement. And then if it was looking a little bit noisy, I would use this and go to about somewhere between 15 and 20. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to go ahead and apply the preset. I'm going to crop out some of the stuff that's going on in the background. It's a little bit distracting. And then I'm actually going to lower the exposure here, lower the highlights, bump some of the shadows. I dehaze this just a little bit. That looks pretty good. And this one is pretty similar as far, it's like a vertical version of the previous one. So I'm going to hit previous to paste the settings. And then I'm going to fix these lines. Otherwise, I think the exposure looks good. So for this one, we were throwing some confetti. We had some shadows. So I'm actually going to raise the exposure more. I'm going to raise this to kind of not completely eliminate, but take most of that harsh shadow out. Bring down white balance. I'm going to crop out some of that ceiling. And raise the blacks, and then I'm going to use Lightroom's remove tool. I'm going to get rid of this black spot, subtract, apply. This is one of the great things of the new versions of Lightroom is that it's using generative AI to get rid of things when you're still in Lightroom instead of having to open up Photoshop. So that looks pretty good. And then I'm just going to, actually, I think I will mask the subject and bring the exposure down on her just a little bit. Add a little more contrast so she stands out a little bit better. Okay, so we have a similar type photo. So I'm going to try using just the preset on her here. I'm going to increase the temperature just a little bit, bump the exposure, lift the shadows, lower the exposure. It's always like a delicate balance kind of game situation. So this time I'm actually going to mask the background and bump it, raise its exposure a little bit, lower the shadows, bump the white a little bit, and there we go. Okay, so I'm going to definitely crop this in a lot. We're going to use the generative AI to remove this thing. I'm going to subtract. And that's pretty awesome that it did it so fast and just like that. And now I can go ahead and edit the photo with the color, contrast, highlights, shadows. So I'm going to try pressing previous, see what it'll do. So it skipped the generative AI option, which I expected. I'm going to expand this a little bit more. Okay. So we're going to crop it. Oops. Crop it. And then, so this is a spot from before. We're just going to move it over here. And so there we go. It eliminates it. I am going to mask the background and lift the shadows and lift the blacks a little bit. Bring down, lift the exposure just a little bit. And then we will add a mask to select the subject. We're going to bump the exposure on her, increase the contrast, lower the highlights just a little bit, lift the shadows so you can see the before and after. So we're going to keep going with this gallery. Oops. Hit R to crop it. I like to use the rule of thirds in cases like this, and I like to put faces in the rule of thirds spots in the intersections if I can. I'll lift the exposure, bump the contrast, and so I'm actually going to leave in the shadow behind her because I think it works. Bump the temperature just a tiny bit, and lift the exposure just a little bit more. And again, this is to my style. I encourage you to find your style. It works for you, but once you have that figured out, it's pretty fast to edit a gallery. So I'm going to use the same settings as in the previous one. And so this one is a little bit different. This one is more in the dark, more shadows. Put my preset on it. And I'll lift the exposure a little bit more. We are going to kind of keep the dramatic shadow in there. And that looks pretty good. Alright, so I'm going to use the previous settings. Now that crop clearly doesn't work. And so I'm going to keep it. Actually, let's reset this. And then use the remove tool to remove the light switch here. So I actually really love this generative AI thing, mostly to remove light switches and that sort of thing. There we go. So I'm going to bump the exposure just a little bit more, and that looks good. Okay, so for this is more of a portrait. I'm going to put my preset on there. I'm going to straighten this out because it is not straight. And then I'm going to lift the exposure. I'm going to leave shadow in there. It doesn't bother me. Bump the contrast, lift the shadows just a tiny bit, and there we go. And then, so for this one, again, I like to have somewhat straight horizon lines, but in this case, I'm going to go on the vertical. That's a personal choice. I'm going to increase. So I was actually using continuous lighting for this photo shoot because it was like a dark and stormy day. Could have used flash, but I felt like the ceilings were a little bit low for what I personally like. So anyway, I think that looks pretty good. We're going to go to the next one and use the previous settings. I'm going to line that up with the window frame. I'm going to expand it just a little bit, and that looks pretty good to me. Alright, so for this one, I'm going to put my preset on there, and really, I don't see much that I would change. I'd bump the exposure a tad, bring the highlights down a little bit, but otherwise that looks good. Okay, so this one's a little bit darker, so I'm going to bump the exposure a little bit more, the shadows a little bit more, otherwise that looks good to me. I'm going to say previous, so we have this cord over here that's a little bit distracting. So I'm just going to crop that in a tad like that. For this, I'm going to put my preset again. I'm going to line it up to that window box thing behind her. Sometimes you just got to roll with it. I'm going to increase the exposure and lower the highlights a little bit. But for my bright style, this works. I'm going to hit previous because it's similar enough. I'm going to lower the exposure. Okay, so I'm going to lift the shadows just a little bit, bring the exposure down just a tad, and then I'm actually going to brush the section right here to bring up the shadows and mostly bring up the shadows and maybe the black a little bit. That improves things marginally. Okay. So, because of that shadow, I'm going to actually crop in a little bit more. Here we go with this one. I'm going to hit it with the preset. I'm going to straighten out the horizon line, and then I'm going to go ahead and crop this side, I call it hutch thing out. I'm going to bump the exposure, and that looks pretty good. So this was more taken from the top. So for this situation, I'm actually going to turn it vertical. Is because that's something that could be used on like social media or something, and then it removes the hutch on the side. So I'm gonna bump that a little bit. So same thing here, except I'm going to keep it horizontal, but I'm going to actually align it a little bit better to the lines in the floor. I'm gonna bump the exposure just a little bit. And then same thing here. I don't have much of corrections. I'm just gonna apply the previous settings, crop this in a little bit. Same thing. I'm going to fix the crop. All right. So for this, apply the preset, bump the exposure a little bit, bring down the highlights some more, lift the shadows just a tad, warm it up a little bit. Okay. So for this, I'm actually going to apply the previous settings, see what happens. I'm going to bring the exposure back down, the highlights down some more. That looks pretty good to me. Hit previous. Okay, so for this, I'm actually gonna lift the exposure and then the crazy lines in the background. I'm gonna align it to the top. I'm gonna crop in so we don't see that vent. And then I'm gonna crop up a little bit more on the coffee table. So that looks a lot cleaner too. For this one, I'm gonna put the preset on there. I'm gonna the exposure, lower the highlights, the temperature just a little bit, and bring that back down, bring that up. And really when it comes to your editing style, sometimes it's really a back and forth between what looks good and what makes you. I'm actually going to borrow the settings from the previous photo. I'm going to crop in a little bit more to get rid of that other wall, and then we're going to rotate this just a little bit to line things up with the verticals in the back. I'm going to lift the shadows, bring the exposure down just a tad, and then this photo is basically the same as the other one. Rotate it just a little bit to align with those lines in the background. There we go. So here's basically a full gallery. So disclaimer, these are actually not the photos I delivered to my client. These are all the ones that I did not deliver. She already received these. And so I just wanted to make that little disclaimer. This is from an actual client shoot earlier this year. This client is a photographer, as you may see by her holding the camera. She wanted to, these are her brand photos. She wanted to show her elegant yet quirky yet sarcastic side. So these confetti, it's kind of like an ironic confetti toss is what she called it. And so really didn't have too many photos of herself smiling, of herself having a little bit more fun. She reads a little bit more serious online in her online persona. So we definitely wanted to bring in a little bit more authenticity. She is more on the serious side, but she also has fun. She laughs. She likes to tell jokes. So we incorporated all of that into her branding shoot. So now I'm ready to export these. So I would just go down to export, choose the folder it needs to go to, rename it with the client name, and fix the settings. In another video, I'll show you my export settings. So hope it's helpful and have a great day. See you next time. So I hope this video was helpful. If you are a photographer who's just getting started in business and you wish you had a checklist to kind of help guide you along the way, be sure to check the description below for my How to Start a Photography Business checklist. And I hope to see you in the next video.